Hey my friends, Matt from Renclif Media here. Welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial I'm going to be going you through the step-by-step process that I use to color grade a landscape scene using Davinci Resolve Studio 17. So this is a clip I'm going to be taking you guys through step by step. I'm just going to play it back now. So that's the result we're going to get at the end of it. And I really hope this tutorial is going to help you guys develop your color grading skills in Davinci Resolve. Now we already have our clip here on our timeline and we'll be working in a 4K timeline. I'll just show you the settings I'm using right now. I'm going to go to my timeline settings. So this is just 4K UHD and it's 25 frames per second. And I shot this clip in 50 frames per second and I've slowed it down 50% speed just to get a nice slow-mo effect on the waves breaking on the beach. Now I'll also show you my color management settings. I'm going to go to my settings tab right here. Now without further ado, we're going to jump into the grade right now. So we're just going to go to our color tab at the bottom. Just going to click on that. Now I am working on a fairly small screen. I'm using a M1 MacBook Air at the moment, and I usually work in dual monitors, but when I'm recording this, I actually can't do that. So I want to show you guys the best color possible. So I'm using my MacBook Air screen. So just bear with me with the size of the screen is a little bit small. Okay, so we have our first node right here, and this is the scene we're starting with. So it's very flat. It's shot with the film profile, and this is 6K BRAW footage on a 4K timeline. But you can use any sort of log footage that has a flat color profile. Beginning with our first node, we're just going to rename this node. We're just going to click on it and go to our node label. And I'm going to type in noise reduction, or noise RED, short for noise reduction. Now, the reason why I make this first node my noise reduction node is because once you start to toggle on noise reduction and effects, it's going to slow down your playback. And I tend to put this node at the very beginning so I can toggle it off at the start, and that way it's not going to slow down my playback when I'm trying to grade my footage. Now, when I selected this noise reduction, I'm going to go to my noise reduction settings here down the bottom. And I'm going to choose look ahead, say 3 frames. And there is a bit of motion in this shot, so I'm going to go better quality, motion range, I'm just going to leave that at medium. Now I tend to add a little bit of luma, so I'm going to go about 4 luma and chroma. And with my spatial noise reduction, I'm going to go better again. I'm going to choose the radius to be medium again. And I'm going to add about 4 just to begin with my spatial threshold. Next we're going to create a new node. We're going to go Option S, create a serial node. Well, that's Alt S on a PC. I'm working on a Mac, as I mentioned. Now I'm just going to call this, change our node label and call this primary grade. You can call it whatever you want. I just like to start with primary grade. Next, we're going to create another node, another serial node. So again, Alt S or Option S. We're going to call this secondary grade. Now I'm going to I usually create 2 parallel nodes. So once I've gotten to my secondary grade, that's pretty much almost as far as I go with the main grades. And then I create my parallel nodes. My parallel nodes are going to be my vignetting, my outer vignette, and my inner vignette, and any other vignette effects that I apply to my footage. So we're just going to go Alt P or Option P, create a parallel node, and I'm going to drag this one to the top just to make this look tidy. I'm going to call this outer vignette. So just out VIG, short for outer vignette. I'm going to create another parallel node. So again, Option P or Alt P. That's going to appear down the bottom. And that's going to be, change my label to inner vignette. So I always have an outer vignette and an inner vignette on all my grades. And if I want to add any other vignettes or any other parallel nodes, I can just add these below it later. Now we can go a bit further with the grade. I am working in Davinci Resolve Studio 17. So I usually go HDR as well with one of my nodes, but if you're working with a free version of Davinci, you might not have a HDR. I believe you don't. Now we're going to go back to our noise reduction, and we're just going to toggle this off using Command D or Control D on a PC. And that way when we play back our footage, we're not going to have any issues with playback because it's not going to be applying that noise reduction. Now we're going to go to our first primary node. And I like to begin with, sorry, I actually left out a node. So I'm going to go Alt S. And this node is going to be our LUT. Sorry about that, guys. We'll start with our primary grade. I'm going to go back to our settings down here. We're going to go to our color wheels. And now I don't usually apply anything yet until I apply my LUT because it's still looking quite flat. So I want to add some color and contrast so I can see how my waveform's looking. Now, when I click on my little clip here down in my clip gallery, you'll see that I've bypassed the color management already. So originally that's ticked off, and Davinci Resolve is applying its own color management, and you'll see it's already adding some color and contrast to this clip. And you can by all means use the Davinci Resolve color management if you want to speed up your color grade and you don't want to use LUTs. But if you want to get more out of the shot, it's a good idea to use LUTs because you can then apply the amount of the LUT that you want to. You can increase the amount of the LUT or you can decrease it depending on the look you want to go for, whether you want it to look more flat or more contrasty. So for this example, I will bypass the color management. So that's just a matter of clicking on your clip here and going bypass color management, and that's going to make it flat again. Now I'm going to go to my LUT, and I'm just going to select a LUT from one of my LUTs. Now you can use any LUT you like, but I'm personally going to use my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera LUTs, which I created. So I'm just going to go to my LUTs here, and I'm going to scroll down to Renclif LUTs, and I'm just going to find my Sign V1 Blackmagic Cinema Camera LUTs. And I'm going to use the natural LUT for this example. So I'm just going to click on that and go Apply LUT to current node. Now I'm just going to minimize this because it's getting in the way, and I'll bring this back across. And I will also close these clips down here because that's kind of getting in the way. So I'm just going to get my workspace and I'm going to close my clips. Just have a bit more room. Okay, so I have my LUT applied, and that's already adding quite a bit of color and contrast, but it's still looking quite flat. You can see with our waveform histogram here, it's still not stretched out enough. It's still not enough contrast. Now, if I toggle, I usually have all my 4 waveform, vector scope, and RGB histogram showing, but because I'm working on a small screen, I don't. But if I use the shortcut Shift Command W, that can bring up my scopes, and I can move these scopes around. So I'll just show you guys, when I look at my vector scope, this is fairly neutral in terms of the color. There's really not much of a push to the warm colors or to the cool colors. It's fairly neutral. And that means that I'm pretty happy with my white balance. So if I just move this down for a sec, I go to my primary, back to my primaries, and I go to my color temperature. I'm really not going to change this much at the moment. I'm just going to leave it. And of course, if you have shot in Blackmagic RAW, you can also go to your camera raw settings right here, and you can adjust things like your ISO. If you change this to clip, it'll allow you to adjust your ISO. You can toggle highlight recovery. You can also change the color temperature here, and the tint and the exposure. So I've already changed my exposure a little bit. I brought it up slightly. If I go back to my waveform, you'll see that, let's move this across. When I toggle this exposure, it moves it up and down, and it was a little bit slightly underexposed to begin with. It was down here, and I've just brought it up slightly. So I will leave that around about there. Now, just using Command Shift Command W again, I'm just going to close that. Now, I also like to look at my RGB parade as well, get an idea of my color levels in my red, green, and blues. And you can see that's looking quite neutral as well. Now I'm going to go back to my color wheels, And I'm just gonna do a little bit of adjustment in here. I'm gonna adjust my gain. I'm gonna bring that up. I wanna bring up more of the highlights. So I'm just gonna bring that up to about 3. Also gonna bring up my gamma slightly. And while I'm doing this, I'm just toggling my full screen view as well using the shortcut Command F or Control F. And that way I can get a clear view of what I'm actually doing. And I can also see how my grade's going by being on my primary grade node and then actually toggling this node on and off while in full screen. So I'll go to my full screen view, Command F or Control F, and now I use the shortcut Command D to toggle that on and off. You can see that's before and that's after, before, after. So getting used to using your shortcuts and toggling these different views is really going to help you with your color grading. Now I just want to do a few more adjustments. I'm going to bring down the lift a little bit. So we're going to go to our lift and we're just going to bring that down to about -0.1. And so far that's looking pretty good. Now I will also add a little bit of curves, but I'm going to do that in my secondary grade. So I'm going to do things like my color temperature adjustment, my exposure adjustment in my primary grade. And then I'm going to go to my LUT. And this is where I'm going to toggle the intensity of the LUT. So I'm going to go to my key right here. And you'll see that the key output of the LUT is 100%. But if I toggle this, if I move this down, it's going to make it less intense. So that's just a way you can change the intensity of the LUT. So I'm going to leave it at 100% because it's quite a flat shot already. And I want to add plenty of contrast and saturation. But you can see the effect that it's having. That's at 100% roughly. And then if I change the key gain down, that's looking a lot flatter. So that's how you adjust the intensity of the LUT that you're using. I'm going to leave it at 1. Now I'm going to go to my secondary grade and I'm going to add a little bit of curves. So I'm going to go to my curves here and I'm just going to bring down the shadows slightly and bring up the highlights a little bit. So you'll see when I toggle this on and off using Command D, it's just adding that slight bit of contrast to the shadows and highlights. And I can always add a little bit more if I want to. Now in my secondary grade, I also do things like I adjust my colors, like my saturation of various colors. So I'll go across here and I've got my hue versus hue. I don't tend to use that much at all. I'll go to my hue versus saturation. Now this is something I use all the time, pretty much every grade. So there's a couple of ways you can use this. You can use your selector right here and you can select an area which you want to bring up the saturation. Say for instance, I want to bring up the saturation in these rocks here. I really like the highlights of the light on these rocks, the warm lighting. I'm going to click on these rocks and it's going to select the color range of those rocks. Now I want to bring up the intensity of the saturation a little bit more. So I'm going to stretch this out a little bit. And when you're stretching it out, make sure you're looking at your levels right here and make sure that stays at 1, because if you're moving this out and you move it down, that's changing all the saturation of all your other colors. So you want to make sure when you're dragging this little node out, that it stays at 1. So I've moved my color range out. Now I'm just going to bring up the saturation a bit. And I'll go to full screen again and just toggle that on and off. And you can see that's adding more saturation, like a subtle amount of saturation to those rocks and also to the yellow reflections here in the water. Now I want to bring it up a little bit more and I'm going to increase the range a little bit more again. So I'm just going to drag that out and I'm going to increase it more. So the more you lift this up, the more saturation it's going to add, but you don't want to go crazy. You don't want to go like all the way up here because that's going to start clipping your colors and making things look strange. So I tend to just move it up gradually a bit at a time. Now there's other ways you can do it. You can select your color range down here with these little color circles right here. So if I wanted, say, yellow and red, I could just do that. And that's a different way you can do it. You can also right click on each of these and it removes it. So if I want to bring that out again even more, that can change the color range. That's another way to do it. And that's looking pretty good. You can see that's really increased the saturation in those rocks and the yellow colors. Next, I'm going to move on to my hue versus luma. And this is where you can adjust the brightness of each color in the scene. So again, I can go to my rocks right here. I can click and select that. Or I can actually go to my yellows and reds. And in this case, I'm going to use the yellow and red option. I'm actually going to right click and delete that. I'm going to move this across. And I want to bring up the luma in these rocks just slightly, just to make it a little bit brighter, before and after. And I also want to bring down the luminance of the clouds. You can see these dark clouds are actually a lot darker in real life. So I'm going to go to my blues. Just going to select my blues right here. And that's a pretty good selection. That's quite a large range of blues. So I'm just going to bring this down. And you'll see as I bring this right down, you'll see how dramatically that's changed the luminosity of the clouds in the sky. It's really making these rocks stand out on the horizon. It's also making the waves stand out more. And it's really adding a lot of depth and contrast to this scene, which was previously flat. That's before, that's after. Before, after. But that's going a little bit too far for me. That's looking a little bit unnatural. So I'm just going to bring it back up a little bit until I'm happy with the result. That's looking quite nice. Maybe a little bit less. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that at the moment. So that's my secondary grading with luminosity, hue versus luma. So now I'm going to go to my luma versus saturation. Now I like to desaturate my shadows a little bit to make it look a bit more film-like. When you have too much color in the dark areas of your scene, it tends to make your footage look a bit more digital. So I like to go to my splines right here. So I'm in my luma versus saturation. I'll go to my splines. I'll select my splines and I'm just going to bring this down. And you'll see that's really desaturated a lot of the image, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to bring up this. Sorry, I just brought that down a little bit too far. I'll just reset that. You can reset it like this, reset all. And that's only reset my luma versus saturation. So I'll go back to my splines, I'll bring it down to about there. Now I'm going to adjust my spline. So I've got a curve that's gradually desaturating the darker areas of the image. So you can see it's not desaturating any of the highlights or the midtones, but it's gradually got a roll off where it desaturates the shadows. I'll bring that down. And I just want to desaturate just the darkest areas. So that's how I like to do it. That's how I've set my spline. So I'm pretty happy with my secondary grade. That's already looking quite nice, but we're still lacking a little bit of contrast and highlights, and we're going to add that in a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to create a vignette. So I'm going to go to my outer vignette, and I'm going to go to my window tab right here, click on a window, and I'm just going to click on a circle. And now I'm just going to drag this out, and I'm going to drag it up. So I'm just going to resize it, make it bigger. And now this is your soft edge. So when you click and drag this, you'll notice that this softness down here is changing. You can also change it by dragging this up if you like. But I usually just begin by dragging it out. And that's a pretty good mount to begin with. And now I want to move this outer vignette to the very edge of the screen. So I'm just going to mouse wheel out a little bit so I can see the edge of my frame. And I just want to drag it all the way to the edge. I only want this vignette to affect the outer area of the image. Now, because I want to affect the outer area, I actually have to invert this. You can see when you look at this, you'll see that it's not inverted, it's affecting the inner part of the window. So by clicking this, now it's going to be affecting the outer part. So now once I've applied that vignette, I want to go back to my color wheels right here. Well, I'm still clicked on the same vignette node. And I can either bring down my offset a little bit, my overall exposure. And then if I go to full screen using Command F and toggle this on and off, it's not really doing much at the moment. But if I add a slight curve, I'll go to my curves and I'll just bring down the shadows slightly. Now I'll go to full screen again. You can see that it's just added a nice outer vignette, a very soft vignette to the outer areas of the image. And that's what I want to put more attention on the main subject, which is these the waves and this little bird here, and also these rocks in the distance. That's really the main subject of this shot right here. And now the inner vignette, I want to highlight or brighten these inner areas of the image. So I'm going to actually hold down Alt or Option on my outer vignette node and click and drag, and I can actually copy that grade to my inner vignette. So at the moment it's copied it, but I actually want to invert it. So I'm going to go back to my window, and I'm going to click back on this inversion, and now it's affecting the inner part of the image. So if I only want to affect the inner part, I just want to resize this inner vignette. I want to bring it right down, like so. Now I tend to target certain areas that I want to draw your eye to, and in this case I want to draw your eye more to what I mentioned, the bird, the waves breaking, and also these rocks in the distance. So that's the area of the image that I want to brighten up. So I'm going to go back to my color wheels right here, and I'm just going to reset this by clicking the reset all. And I'm going to go back to my curves, and instead of bringing down the shadows, I want to reset this. So I'm just going to right click on that, and it's going to get rid of that. I want to bring up my highlights slightly. So when I go to my full screen using Command F and I toggle this on and off, you can see that it's added a highlight to this area of the vignette. So it's just highlighting this area right here, and that's looking quite nice. But again, I'm going to go back to my window, and I'm just going to extend this a little bit. I'm just going to drag it out, and I'm going to narrow it down slightly. And I'm just going to move it a little bit over the bird and the rocks in the distance, because that's the area I want to focus on. So I'm going to go back to my full screen using Command F or Control F, toggle that on and off, and I'm pretty happy with that so far. So if I go back to go out of full screen and I select these two nodes using Command and selecting each node, I go back to full screen and I toggle both these nodes on and off, you're going to see that it's just drawing your eye further to that area of the image. Now, so far it's looking good, but it's still lacking a little bit of contrast. So what I want to do is I want to go back to my secondary grade here, and I just want to add a little bit more curves. Just going to drag this up slightly, and a little bit more contrast to the shadows. So it's looking quite nice. Now, also I want to add a little bit more saturation, but I'm going to do it in my primaries. So I'm going to go back to my primary color wheels, and I'm just going to use this little color boost, which is really handy for really boosting the colors. I'm just going to bring that up slightly. So even bringing this up a tiny bit really boosts the colors. You'll see the difference that it makes. If I was to bring this right up, it's just going to start looking too saturated and unnatural. And I want to keep that slight film effect, so I want to make it look a little bit less saturated than that. So I'll go a little bit less than that. I'll go around 5. And that's looking quite nice. You can see it's just boosted the color really nicely. You can also boost the saturation a little bit. So I'm just going to bring this up about 55. And that's looking nice and natural. That's pretty much how I remember it at the time. It was maybe a little bit warmer on these rocks. And the color of these rocks is maybe a little bit more yellow. So I can go in and change that. I can go out of my full screen again. And I can go to my tint. I can either go to my camera and do it that way, or if I'm not using BRAW footage, I can use my tint right here. And you can see when I bring down the tint, it's just bringing up the greens here in my parade, in my histogram. So I just want to bring up the greens a little bit, because I remember the beach and the rocks were a little bit more yellow. So I'm going to bring down the tint to maybe about -9. Actually, maybe a bit less, maybe -7. Now I'll go to full screen, and that's looking a little bit more yellow in the rocks, and that's looking more natural. And the other way you can do it is go to your camera raw and go to your color temperature and tint and do it that way, okay? So we're going to go back to our color wheels, and we still want to add a little bit more contrast, but I'm going to do this in my in a different method. I'm actually going to use the HDR tools. So if you don't have the HDR tools, you can actually just use your curves. It's not going to be quite as fine tuned, but you can do things like you can add an extra point here, and you can just add a few extra points if you want to isolate the highlights a little bit more. So I want to just bring up more of the specular highlights. So I can add a little point here again and bring that up slightly. Or if I want to bring down my midtones a little bit, or bring them up a little bit, I can add the point there and do it that way. You can also use the HDR tools, which is what I prefer to use. So I'm just going to add an extra node. I'm going to go Alt S and add a serial node. And I've added this onto my secondary node. So this is going to be my final node. And I'm going to call this HDR. Now with HDR, when you go to your HDR tab here, it really allows you to fine tune your highlights, your midtones, your shadows, and your blacks. It really separates those different areas, so you can really add some nice brightness to certain areas or darkness to certain areas within the scene. Now I like to go to my specular, and I like to bring this up because that's going to bring up some highlights in these waves right here that are almost completely white. And while I'm doing this, I'm looking at my scopes. So I'll just go to my Command-Shift-W again, and I'll bring up my scopes. And I'm usually looking at my histogram as well. I'm looking to see if I'm clipping in any of the colors. At the moment, I'm not. But you can see if I was to actually bring up these specular and these highlights, say for instance, I was going to bring up the exposure like so, I'm still not clipping, but if I was going to bring up the light, it's really pushing the histogram to the right. You can see that. And then if I go too far, it's going to start clipping. You can see that now it's clipping my red, green, and blues. So that's a good way to tell whether you're clipping your highlights or your shadows. I'm going to bring it up so slightly without clipping any of those channels. So I can go a little bit further with my lights. Usually about 20 to 30 is a good amount. And also with my highlights, I can bring that up a little bit. Because this is all about fine tuning those bright and dark areas. So you just want to go in small amounts. You don't want to go crazy with it. And when I toggle this node on and off, you can see what that's doing. It's just adding more contrast and it's making it look more punchy. And I'm also going to go to my shadows. So each of these allows you to select your specular highlights, light, your shadows, your darks, and your blacks. So I'm going to go to my shadows and I'm going to bring that down slightly. And I'm going to go to my darks and bring that down a little bit as well. And you can see that if I were to bring down my darks a lot, it's not really doing much here. But if I was to bring down my shadows, because that's more of a big range, you can see what it's doing to the histogram. It's actually changing it a lot. So with my shadows, I tend to just adjust that very, very slightly. But with my darks, you have more of a fine-tune adjustment, and same with your blacks. So maybe about -10 with my darks. I'm not actually going to worry about my blacks because they're pretty good. Maybe bring that up a little bit. So that's before and after. It's really just fine-tuning those bright and dark areas. And at the end of it, when I'm ready to finalize this and export the clip and deliver it, I can just toggle this noise reduction node on. Now, if you've got any questions about this color grade or my color grading process or anything filmmaking related, feel free to drop a comment below and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. And I also have a really cool tip sheet that I've created on Davinci Resolve, which has all my shortcuts which I use for both the editing tab and the color tab. So make sure you download that. I'll have a link in the description below. It's a Davinci Resolve 17 shortcut sheet, and you can download that from my shop, and it's completely free. So be sure to download that if you haven't already. It's really going to be helpful to you guys. Take care guys and enjoy your filmmaking, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. See ya.